So shall we gather in your room for a picture time after you take the video?
That would be great. That would be great.
Aren't you so sweet? Aren't you so sweet? Aren't you so sweet?
What you're seeing is a not-so-typical portrayal of a woman becoming a mother, a much less typical family about to be made, and a baby becoming part of a family who looked nothing like her at all. That baby was me. I have no recollection of this, of course, but my body certainly does. And I wish I could remember the first time I sat on the airplane to the United States, received my green card, and became a US citizen officially. I wish I could recollect memories of my birth family, the monks who took care of me, and the nanny who I was apparently very fond of while at the orphanage. There are many I wishes in my life, and I have just discovered within these last 2 years what they are. If you had asked me even 3 years ago how I felt about my adoption, my response would have been very direct. I am not interested in investigating more. Adoption is processed by many in radically different and, in some cases, very similar ways, and no experience of an adoptee is the same.
Hi, my name is Emily, and I love learning foreign languages first and foremost. But you might wonder, what does foreign language learning have to actually do with adoption? Because they seemed so far removed from each other. So let's start from the very beginning, because about 2 months ago, I decided I wanted to embark on learning my 9th language. And I decided about even a month ago that language would be Chinese. And I know I'm going to get some of these comments like, why do you think learning Chinese for you is going to be such a big deal? Because you look Asian, obviously you have to do something with the culture. Why is this such a big deal in the first place? So according to many, that might make sense. That is such a simplified answer that does not give me my own autonomy, a voice, nor control over my own story. And of course, my story is dealing with a lot of nuanced emotions that I don't think I will ever get a lot of closure on just because of the situation. I will be addressing this perspective a little bit more in further videos, but I will not be answering them in this video. If you are interested in knowing more, please go down and click the subscribe button as well as the notification bell whenever I get those videos out. I also have the option to subscribe to my newsletter down below in the description, just so you can stay up to date. If people don't have more of a context around my personal background, then I feel like my answers to why am I learning Chinese in the first place will not carry the weight that I want them to or be truly understood. In my opinion, it's also essential for me to tell my own adoption story instead of having others tell it for me. I am sure fellow adopted people can relate to this. You know, not only do I want to give more background as to why I'm learning Chinese this year, why it's so important, but I also seek to add a perspective to the typical adoption story, because I think when I was searching on YouTube even, I only saw videos from the adopted parents' perspective. That is almost exclusively what I found on the internet, and I really want to be a voice out there that is from an adoptee. It took me 2 decades to open up to this side of my story, but I am ready to let you in. So I was born most likely in southern China during the time period where the one-child policy was still very much in effect. I was one of the 120,000 babies, mostly girls, that were given up for adoption in that period. 85,000 approximately were adopted from Americans. We were left in various locations. I was left at a Buddhist temple. I know other adoptees who were left at police stations, under city benches, on a really busy street. And of course, there were already preferences given to wanting boys over girls, and the one-child policy greatly aggravated this as well. Most of us were found with a note, "This is mine," and I don't know what it exactly says, but you can find the translation to the side. I was left with only this, nothing else. when I was left at the temple. Before I even turned 2, I was passed between at least 3 primary caregivers. I, of course, ended up with my dear mom, who adopted me in 1998 and brought me back on my very first plane ride to the United States. Just to be clear, I am very content with my adopted family. I don't usually use adopted versus birth family to distinguish between those sides of who I come from, because I really find that my adopted family is just my family, and that's it. Just so we are clear on which parents I am referring to. I always knew that I was adopted. My mom was very, very open about that. She always read me I love you like crazy cakes. That was a big bedtime story staple in our house. I remember every part of the story because we read it so many times. As you can see, I was raised in an exclusively white family, and it took me decades to really internalize what that meant for me. I didn't really truly understand how my perspective on myself, as well as my perspective on the world, how that would all change because of one very pivotal moment in my life that I can't truly remember in the past. Of course, we are all shaped by circumstances that we cannot change growing up. Growing up in a transracial family where I was the only person who was not white really influenced how I saw myself. And this was not only reflected in my family, this was reflected in cartoons I watched, the content that I consumed throughout the media when it wasn't so diversely represented in the United States, unfortunately. I latched on to beauty standards that would only truly accommodate for white features. And where I grew up in the South in the United States, there just wasn't a lot of diversity in my friend group either. But as far as I can remember, no one really made me feel different. No one made me feel like I was a different race from them. They didn't really make me feel like I wasn't white, in a sense. On one hand, I feel lucky for this because I'm so thankful that I wasn't thrown with discrimination and microaggressions from a really early age when I was still establishing more about who I was as a person. Because I know a lot of adoptees have faced this, unfortunately, especially if they are biracial or in a transracial family, just like I am. On the other hand, the fact that I almost exclusively only saw white faces and was not really made to feel different from who I saw, that led me to subconsciously interpret myself of wanting to be white and sometimes fooling myself into thinking I was white. I was not really prepared for how the world would view me and my ethnicity primarily until I was in my mid-20s when I was about to study abroad. In fact, I didn't really think about adoption as deeply as I do now until my mid-20s. A lot of people who know me already and kind of know some background on my adoption story, they're going to be really surprised that I am sharing this part of me with the rest of the world. And I didn't want to reflect much on my adoption. Leading up to the point where I was going abroad, especially between high school and college, I noticed more international students. Some of them happened to be Chinese international students, and I will never forget the feeling of being so alienated and feeling so wrong being even in the same room as them. Of course, at the time, I didn't really know why I felt that way. It reflected on the fact that I didn't want to be in a place with people who I probably would have had the same culture as, had the same mannerisms as, maybe would have dressed the same as had it not been for my adoption. I finally got to see a physical manifestation of myself and of people who had similar facial features to me. And growing up how I did, that was a very, very big shock, honestly. As we move more into when I was getting ready for college, I do not think my life story and my adoption story can be complete without going a little bit more into my language learning story. If you know me, you already know, especially in my personal life, or if you've met me from abroad, that I love learning languages ever since I discovered my own methods for self-studying them. I was raised monolingual my whole life until I discovered German, and then once I started German, I was accepted to a program in Italy, so I started learning Italian as well. Once I was abroad, the biggest culture shock was not the really relaxed lifestyle of the Italians. It was not really the directness, practicality of the Germans even. It was a culture shock that was also a life shock because the difference of how the world perceived me versus how I saw myself was very challenged in that time that I was abroad. As I mentioned before, I grew up in a white family that did not make me feel any different from them, race-wise especially. But I would say once others did not believe I was American when I was abroad, compared to my American white friends who were automatically believed and not interrogated I think that difference really struck a chord with me and made me realize that I would not be accepted for who I knew that I was. I always said I was American. I always defined myself through my cultural identity more than I did my ethnic identity. Because of my adoption, of course. I have come to realize that no matter where I am in the world, there will always be someone, and the majority of people, who will identify me just by my ethnic identity, even without hearing my life story. I finally realized a little bit too that a lot of people probably saw me as very different from my adopted family when I was growing up. They just didn't voice it. As humans, of course, our identities change over time. Indeed, they always evolve. In my case, I had to come to terms with the dissonance that existed between the white community that I grew up in, who I felt accepted by, compared with how the outside world perceived me as, and the fact that they did not care to know my story behind my ethnicity that they saw. I found myself very unable to relate to my American friends who came from very traditional American families, and my struggle with this kept on revealing itself fully when I was abroad. So of course it was tiring to convince people that I was just as American as my American friends. I was never caught in between too white to be Asian, but too Asian to be white. I was, again, never made to feel extremely different from my white peers. Not like when I was abroad. I felt fully 1000% American, and I still do, but I knew that I would not be, and still will not be, accepted as such in many parts of the world. Moreover, it was very hard to explain the concept of adoption to other cultures where that was definitely not the norm. Additionally, not all people, but many people were entitled enough to tell me that I had a duty to go back to my roots and learn Chinese, especially after finding out that I had such a large passion for language learning. Of course, learning a language like that hits a much deeper nerve. It's one of the worst feelings for me to meet someone who is so entitled they think that they can tell me how I must live life solely based on my ethnicity, instead of just letting me process adoption on my own terms. I have had zero interest in learning Chinese, as well as any other Asian languages, my whole life, but I'd never met anyone who was so insistent on me learning Chinese as when I went abroad. When I get all of these invalidating comments of my own experience and wishes, and of course that's going to deter me from wanting to learn Chinese even further. But over these past few years, especially during the pandemic, it has been through my own processing of my own adoption that has led me to want to reclaim my identity in a way, also be so open with what has happened to me. I don't think I'll ever be done wondering about my birth family, wondering what kind of physical features or personality traits even that I shared with them, what their goals and dreams, wishes were. I think those factors are sometimes taken for granted in such traditional families, right? You know where your eyes or your nose or your hair came from which parent. You know your medical history, and I just will never have that. I love my family, but I think that there is always a feeling that's nagging inside me, being like, I was taken from my biological parents, and that is never a totally positive feeling. And I know for many Chinese adoptees, especially in my situation, we will most likely never have access to that information. For others, they were just not able to stay with their biological parents for whatever reason. And I think that for me, that's going to take a lifetime to process. So I feel very fortunate to be raised in the United States, but obviously I can't speak for all adoptees. We come from so many cultures, backgrounds, and experiences, and we all have nuanced emotions and opinions surrounding what we could not ultimately control. Not all adoptees will carry the same trauma or will carry as much trauma as others. There's really no right or wrong way to think about this topic. But I do hope to raise awareness around more adoption to others who are not adoptees themselves, and really show that language learning as well, whatever language that I decide to learn, I think especially with Chinese, that definitely goes hand in hand with my life story, and I think that deserves some attention too, as I share my language learning journey as well with you. In the end, it's very natural to judge others, which is what we all do, but I think that you can only go so far in knowing someone's story just based off of their ethnicity. We all have trauma, in some way. We all want belonging. I wanted belonging that whole time, especially when I noticed many people abroad made me feel like I didn't belong in where I thought I did, which was the United States. But I think self-studying Chinese this year especially will help me to process even more a lost identity, processing even a place where, in my personal situation, I know I don't belong, but a place where a lot of others think I do anyways, and a place where I would have belonged had it not been for my adoption. By doing this comes with a lot of healing too, because I'm finally processing what makes me really different from the traditional family. For all the adoptees out there, especially transracial, transnational adoptees like myself, we know that we have so much more to offer than just our adoption status. We have the right to privacy with how much we want to share or not. While it has taken me 2 decades to get to this point where I am comfortable enough, as vulnerable as I am about my own story, I want to be a voice for other adoptees who may not be comfortable with sharing their similar stories. And also knowing that vulnerability goes a long way in the world. It goes really far, and I think we need to have more of it. Just by even sharing my small story in the corner of what we call the internet, that will hopefully open up more of a discussion to listening to other people's radically different perspectives, and especially adding a voice to the language learning community where there is just not a lot of representation for adoptees yet. So as I embark on my journey to learn Chinese, I do not know how I will react, but I know that with it will come a lot of confrontation with myself, getting closure, or at least as much closure as I can, found on my own terms. All that being said, I do know that my learning Chinese needs a lot more background than what you would typically expect for learning a language. Language learning at this point goes a lot deeper for me than just wanting to know a different culture or wanting to travel someplace. Wanting to get to work abroad. Not that those are not valid reasons. Those are lovely reasons, and they are reasons for some of the languages that I've learned in the past. But I think I can also use language learning as a tool to dig deeper, as a coping mechanism, and I can't wait to share my discoveries with you on that front. Thank you for being here with me. I know that even sharing the story was a big step for me, and I wasn't sure that I could get through it, honestly, but here I am, and here you are. And for those of you who know me personally, I hope that you learned something new about me. For those who just stopped by, make sure to subscribe down below, as well as to the newsletter in the description if you do not want to miss any more announcements from me, especially to keep up with my journey learning Chinese and all of my reflections with it starting next month. Don't forget to also comment down below if you found any sort of value in this video of what I've shared with you today. Be sure to share with others if you really do think that they can have some value from it as well. I am excited to share my journey with you, however it evolves.